cart there for anybody who would like one. We've got two main items, the pedestrian bicycle master plan, item 1, and then the street maintenance program funding is item 2. Before we turn over to staff to dig into those two items, I'll ask for public comment, and if somebody's here and they'd like to comment on anything on our agenda or not on our agenda, you're welcome to do so. If it's on one of those two items and you want to wait until you've heard the presentation, please feel free to do that too. Just ask that you tell us your name and address and keep your comments to 3 minutes. So please come forward to the podium.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Joan Smith. I live at 1400 Poly Drive in Billings, Montana. Mayor Cole and council members, I noticed an unsafe intersection in the school crossing area at Highland School. I did bring 2 pictures. Oh, so pass those around. And I have an idea on how this could be improved. The corner is actually more complicated than it may seem, and it is dangerous during school starting and dismissal times. Despite the good work of the crossing guard, this school zone does not really meet standards for safety. And I believe now is the right time to address this potentially hazardous situation. The Highland crosswalk area includes 2 streets. Park Hill runs from west to east to downtown, and 8th Street West runs north and south. It ends at Park Hill, but it has a near continuation onto Delphinium, which makes it complicated. And every morning and afternoon, one crossing guard holding up a stop sign has to control multiple flows of traffic at this 3-way corner. And visibility is blocked by the many parked cars, trucks, and SUVs. Now, there is a signpost with flashing lights that says 20 miles per hour when flashing. However, I don't think it's really located where we need it to be. Because if you can look closely at the picture, you'll see that the flashing sign is actually beyond where the crosswalk is. So, and I believe that having it located at that spot actually adds to the problem, because drivers who are approaching that area but intending to turn south onto 8th Street West may think that the speed zone doesn't apply to them because they're turning before they get to that point. In fact, the school crossing area includes kids crossing 8th Street West, and drivers routinely turn that corner too fast. So the flashing light actually makes the problem worse by misleading drivers as to where this reduced speed zone begins. It would make much more sense to take the flashing light and move it further to the west along the block between 8th and 9th. That would make it clear to drivers that this whole entire intersection is in the school crossing zone. I actually believe that the safest solution, does that mean 3 minutes?
It is, but go ahead, wrap up.
The safest solution would be to make the intersection into a 3-way stop by installing full stop signs for both directions on Park Hill. However, if 3-way stop signs cannot be approved for us, then at the very least, please relocate the flashing sign further toward 9th Street West so that drivers approaching the school zone will be alerted before they get to 8th Street West. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. And Ms. Smith, by good coincidence, our Public Works Director is sitting back there and heard all of that. And so it'd be her department who would look into that.
Oh,
so
good. I did print out copies of.
And if you need to follow up, you could contact whoever Debbie tells you at Public Works for more information, I would think.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Any other public comment?
Hi, my name is Rita Newman. I live at 1204 Nasturtium Drive and Billings Heights. And I have reached out to Jennifer. I've actually tried to reach out to several and not heard back from other council members. But I'm here to bring to the city council's attention an issue that I'm living with in my neighborhood in this Daniel subdivision. Those of us that live there, we're all tax-paying residents of the city. Several of us have called in complaints to animal control over the issue of noisy nuisance of dogs with one of the neighbors who is breeding and selling dogs, cats, and I was told birds from her house. There is no business license that can be found for this individual. We've been subjected to the constant barking, the smell of animal waste that drifts through the air. And it's just a horrible situation to live in. We have to spend our time, our money, our resources to document and prove that this problem exists. Animal control has gone to that residence. I requested the records, and I believe it's been 12 times. 3 of those occasions had no record. 3 of them that I called in are not even documented. And yet, this has continued. Their response to us is they have a small animal permit, and the dogs are licensed. The records show from animal control, they have had as many as 20 dogs and 16 cats there at one time on one of those visits. They're breeding and selling these animals. There's no control. There's no training. They put them in the back. Even when they're in the house, there's so much noise and barking. You can still hear them. I have a home office. Another lady has a home office. It's difficult to conduct business. We can't open the windows when the weather's nice because of all the noise. The small animal permits, as far as animal control is concerned, they have a permit. So all the research I've done so far shows that the city administrator delegated that to animal control, who in turn turned around and told the animal shelter to issue the permits. That's a 1-page document. They pay a fee. That's it. There's nothing. So there are several, I'll try to get through this real quick. There's several Montana codes that reference the rights of property owners, rules for subdivisions, covenants running with the land, control of nuisances, county class of licenses, which I haven't been able to locate yet for Yellowstone County. The city ordinances that I have found, 035259 and 035351, both address small animal permits, violations, penalties, noisy animals, complaints, commercial kennels, which means, and it includes any lot, building, structure, or premise where they're kept for boarding, training, breeding, and selling. That is what is going on. I now have to go to court because she's fighting a ticket and has decided that she's being harassed, while the rest of us, I guess that's not harassment, to have to be subjected to all of this. So I have statements. Here are pictures of what, this is one of them. This is just one of the number of animals, dogs, how they're kept at that property. Yet, animal control, they have not revoked that permit. They have a responsibility to revoke the permit, and they've done nothing. So this, and then the response I'm getting is this is a civil matter. Well, This may very well become a civil matter that in part was created because of the lack of action by the city. I'm not sure all of the departments involved because the covenants that are filed with the city and the county for that subdivision clearly state there's a 2-dog limit. I spoke with Yellowstone Valley Animal Shelter. They don't look at anything. They're there to sell them by the direction
Okay.
of animal control.
And I apologize, I missed your name and the address of the problem property. What was your name again?
My name is Rita Newman.
Okay. And the property address? Do you know?
Problem or my address?
The problem property, do you know?
1209 Mossman Drive.
Okay, very good. That, now we can ask for a little more detail from animal control and anybody else.
I would appreciate it. Something needs to be done. The city council has the right to do things. Montana Code has things there. City administrator, it should have been revoked according to the ordinances. It should have been revoked a long time ago, and it hasn't been revoked, which is the fallback for animal control.
Okay, thank you for bringing this to our attention. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comment? Any other public comment? No one is coming forward. And again, there'll be an opportunity later on each of these items. We'll move ahead then with our first item, pedestrian bicycle master plan. I think Lisa's going to provide a bit of an introduction for Mac at Alta. And Mac, you're with us out there, I hope. You can go ahead and.
Yes, I am. Can you all hear me?
We can. So you're sounding good. So Lisa's bringing up the PowerPoint. Hopefully you'll be able to see that as well. So once that's up, we'll turn it to Elise.
And Mac, you can just let me know when you want me to kind of scroll through and also if you can't see the changes. But, okay. Well, thank you, City Council, for having us tonight. This is just kind of a check-in presentation on our pedestrian and bicycle master plan. We started doing these this isn't exactly midway, but partway check-ins, I guess I'll say, so that you all have some more information before it comes to you at adoption. So we've got Mac Drzajic is on the line here from Alta Planning and Design, who's our consultant on the project. Sanderson Stewart is sub-consulting and helping out with the public engagement. We've kind of been kind of going through some kind of data collection and analysis, but we're about to swing back into public outreach, get our steering committee re-engaged and things like that. So we thought this would be a good time to give you an update so you can hear what's coming up. So as I mentioned, we're going into our second phase of public outreach. The first phase, we had over 200 responses to our survey and 189 comments on the interactive map. We tried to do a lot of different things to get people involved. We had our public meeting. There were 75 people who attended, and we did like a little cookie decorating exercise, just trying to make fun events. And Mac will tell you about our next fun event to try to get people involved. And we also posted flyers around the community at different parks and things like that to try to get the word out to people where they are. So with that, I'll let Mac introduce himself, and then I'll just give a little description of the disclaimer that we're planning to put in. That's the same as the one we put in our Safe Routes to School plan, and then Mac will take the rest of the presentation. So Mac, if you'd like to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, everyone, and thanks for letting me join virtually. I'm Mac Drzajic, the project manager on the consultant team for this project. I'm grateful to be working in Billings again. I've had a couple planning experiences in Billings with the bicycle pedestrian wayfinding plan, as well as the bike and scooter share feasibility study, and been involved as well in the Fifth Avenue North corridor study with Sanderson Stewart as well. But yeah, Alta Planning and Design is a transportation planning and engineering and design firm focused solely on active transportation and sustainable mobility. And I am based out of our Salt Lake City office, but have been on the saddle on a bike there in Billings on a few occasions. So I've been privileged to become pretty familiar with the local street network and trail network there. But yeah, my background's in landscape architecture, but been doing transportation planning with Alta for the last 5 years or so. So that's just a little bit about me and the company.
So this is only part of the presentation I'm going to cover, but I just wanted to remind you, we had, the discussion with the Safe Routes to School Phase 2 plan, and we are planning to put that same disclaimer into this plan, basically saying that it's a planning level document. It doesn't obligate funds to the project unless you all or Public Works decides to do so. And then also saying that it outlines the recommendations as of the adoption date, and then mentions that kind of system-wide plan that the city is thinking about conducting, and saying that, we understand that there may be some contradictions. So, so we may have to come back and edit this plan to make the two align. So just wanted to remind you that that's going in there. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mac.
Yeah, thanks. And I don't have control of the slide, so is it okay if I just cue next slide whenever I need it?
Yep, that sounds great.
Okay. Awesome. Well, today I'm hoping to just, like Elise mentioned, just kind of catch you up to speed on what we've been working on and where we're at. That's going to include a discussion around the vision and the goals that have been established for the plan. We also did an audit and kind of looked back the last 6 or 7 years since the last plan was adopted to kind of see and present a progress report, if you will, of infrastructure that's been built. I'll talk a little bit about the phase 1 outreach and what we heard, and then the approach that we've been taking in developing new project recommendations or building on the 2017 plan rather for this time around. And then I'll finish up with some next steps. But this, hopefully you've had a chance to read it already, but the vision for the bicycle and pedestrian master plan update, this is almost verbatim from the last plan, just with some minor tweaks, based on input we received from stakeholders and the steering committee for this project. Yeah, this is the overall vision that we're trying to achieve. And if you go to the next slide, this leads in directly to the goals of the plan. So we're really trying to complete this sentence, right? When it's all said and done, what are the outcomes we're hoping for that the system will achieve? Those are listed there on the right. So we hope that the Billings area pedestrian bicycle system will make useful connections, will serve a wide variety of people, will increase the safety and health of the community, will enable efficient and sustainable implementation, and will expand transportation choices. That's really kind of at the foundation of this plan, and any kind of bicycle and pedestrian efforts is expanding freedom of choice for anyone who is interested in walking or biking, either for recreation or transportation in Billings. Next slide. Yeah, so this is just a quick snapshot that came out of our, I guess what we're calling our progress report, of mileage of facilities built since 2017, which is when the last plan was adopted. So we've seen some on-street bikeways implemented, especially with the implementation of the Avenue D neighborhood bikeway. That's what you see in 2021 there, but also a handful of bike lanes and buffered bike lanes throughout the community. Sidewalks have gone in mostly on a development basis. Those typically aren't standalone projects. And then as far as trails, and when we say trails, we're referring to shared use paths. These are paved two-way facilities intended for multiple non-motorized uses, such as walking and biking. But since 2017, there's been an increase in mileage of trails by 14.5 miles. And as I'll just say, as an outside visitor, I've always been impressed with Billings trail network, and always love to get out on a bike and on the trails. And so I look forward to continuing to see those expand as they are today. But this map shows locations of basically what you just saw in the statistical snapshot, highlighted in pink, these areas where some of these facilities have been implemented over the last 6 or 7 years. And the plan itself will include kind of a full report of what those are and then some lessons learned, which is on the next slide, sorry. Where we kind of conducted an audit of what's going well and what could be improved and we did that at the beginning of the plan so that we could focus the direction of the recommendations where staff felt it would be most helpful. So some things that we learned in these conversations with steering committees, stakeholders, and city staff and MPO staff is that funding and staff capacity obviously continue to be limiting factors. But there's been a lot of progress, especially the NPO has been successful in obtaining external funding for a handful of projects. The majority of the completed projects that you saw on that map seem to have come from synergy created with Public Works and their ongoing CIP projects and maintenance projects. And so that's a plus, and it's clear to us as just outsiders that there's really good synergy between planning staff and Public Works in Billings, to where Public Works is doing a great job of referencing the current Trails and Bikeways Master Plan and making sure that those lines on the map become reality whenever the opportunity arises with their operations. So those are just a handful of lessons learned that have come out of this audit and progress report. Next slide, please. Elise already kind of touched on some of these numbers, but in November of 2023 through January of 2024, we conducted the first phase of public outreach, and this was led by our teammates, Sanderson Stewart, who are there based locally in Billings, as you know, who have been leading our public outreach efforts. They created a website, which included an online survey and an online comment map, and also conducted an in-person open house. And really this first phase was geared towards understanding attitudes and preferences, as well as needs and opportunities in the community for improvements to the bicycle and pedestrian system. Next slide. So who did we hear from? We heard from, as you can tell by this graph, some people who walk and bike for recreation on a regular basis. Next slide. We also heard from people who walk and bike for transportation, but as you can see the difference that, we heard from a lot of people that don't, and that's okay too. That helps us understand who we're hearing from and what the needs and preferences are for community members in Billings when it comes to walking and biking. Next slide. We heard mostly from people who feel walking and biking in Billings is safe, as shown by these two charts about biking and walking respectively. But several who think that improvements could be made. But generally we heard from people that think it's either somewhat safe or very safe, so that's good. Next slide. And then some of the things we heard, we asked what are some things that prevent people from walking or biking more often, and some of the top responses was exposure to cars, inclement weather, lack of connectivity, and travel distances being just too far for walking and biking. Some of those obviously are within our control, and some of them are not. And so, especially with regards to weather, right? Billings is a unique place in the United States for weather and has impacts on people traveling outside of a car and inside of a car. Distances to destinations is an interesting one too. It's an obvious one, but you can kind of make implications about development patterns and how more spread out development patterns lead to longer distances between destinations and less suitable for walking and biking. Next slide. Pedestrians were asked what would make them more comfortable walking, and some of the highest priorities included separation from cars, wider sidewalks, and in general low traffic environments where either the speeds or the volumes are lowered. And that's kind of a no-brainer. I think we all feel the same way as we're walking. We like to feel safe and separated from vehicle traffic. But next slide. And lastly, and again, this is just a snapshot. A full review and report from the public input summary can be found in the report itself. But This was just a question asked to citizens about investment dollars and preference to see investments being made in bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure. Next slide. So now getting into our approach. For those of you familiar with FHWA, that stands for Federal Highway Administration, and they are an arm of the U.S. Department of Transportation, provide a lot of guidance to planners and engineers across the country on how to design transportation networks. And so they, in 2019, published this guide, which was published, if you'll note, since the adoption of the last Billings Trails and Bikeways Master Plan. And it focuses on how to develop not just the network, but also how to select specific facility types in a way that will achieve a high comfort network and something that is appealing to the majority of people who are interested in walking and biking, and not just the minority of strong, fearless, confident cyclists who are riding their bikes or walking probably regardless of the infrastructure. And so if you go to the next slide, this graphic comes from that FHWA guide, which is based on about a decade of research regarding people's preferences and tolerance for exposure to motor vehicle traffic. And so the majority of existing and potential cyclists have limited tolerance for exposure, what the FHWA has found. And if they perceive that their exposure is too high, they'll choose not to ride. And this is obviously specifically related to bicyclists. And so generally, the FHWA guidance is focused on designing for this larger group that they call the interested but concerned. They're people who are interested in riding a bicycle but concerned about safety, especially exposure to motor vehicle traffic. However, we recognize, and you recognize, that designing for the interested but concerned group in every scenario is not very practical and likely not feasible. So if you go to the next slide, this kind of outlines the approach that we've taken in developing the recommended network for Billings bikeway and trail network. So the first step is focusing on that group to make sure we have a high comfort network. A lot of times in previous planning efforts, high comfort facilities were chosen on kind of where possible basis, and often resulted in not necessarily a network, but fragments of high comfort facilities. The goal here is to actually create a connected network of high comfort facilities, as indicated by the black thicker lines you see on that diagram. Again, these are the types of facilities that appeal to the interested but concerned group. High comfort implies separation from motor vehicle traffic or mixed traffic on quiet neighborhood streets. So that's a big distinction there. A lot of times people think high comfort automatically means a shared use path or a protected bike lane, but it can also mean things like the Avenue D neighborhood bikeway, where generally a wide variety of people in confidence ranges feel comfortable riding their bike on that facility. The idea then is to then, same slide, augment that high comfort network with what we're calling supplemental bikeways. These make additional connections, but they may not be connecting to the most important destinations or regionally significant destinations in Billings. And they generally are more appealing to the highly confident or somewhat confident cyclists that were referenced on that green graphic from FHWA. They primarily consist of visually separated bikeways, such as bike lanes or buffered bike lanes and shoulders. And they can always, they don't always have to remain as that category. They can be enhanced later on to be high comfort if deemed necessary. But our goal with this is to try to identify what is that high comfort network, and then what are the additional connections that need to be made. So if you go to the next slide, I realize this is probably difficult for you to read on the screen, but this is a snapshot of the draft recommended network. Oh, I lost it. And so you'll notice it's much more simplified from the last map in the 2017 plan. In the 2017 plan, specific facility types were being called out, such as striped bike lane or shared roadway or separated bike lane or buffered bike lane. In this rendition, we are suggesting that it be simplified to high comfort network and supplemental network. The reason for this stemmed from conversations with Public Works early on in the process when we were kind of doing our audit and asking them what's going well and what's not, and they really felt that the specification of facility type at a master plan level made the public process more difficult, and it made their jobs a little bit more difficult because it kind of ignored the fact that there is a lot of feasibility analysis that still needs to be done on some of these lines. And so the hope is that we're close, right? That it is feasible to achieve a high comfort environment wherever you see a dashed black line or a solid blue line. And these have all been vetted by both city and county public works as well. So we are in the process actually with still hearing back from the county on a couple of segments that are in question, but city public works has definitely gone through this with a fine-tooth comb, and we've had many conversations back and forth. And so the lines you see are dark. The solid black lines are existing facilities that, per the standards set up by FHWA, are considered high comfort now. And we suggest they remain the same. The solid blue or purplish line that you see, those are facilities where there is existing maybe striped bikeways, for example, but they were identified as an important link in the high comfort network, and so that this plan is recommending that they see some kind of future improvement to upgrade them to meet the standards of FHWA. The dashed black lines are new connections that have not yet been made, and many of these come from the 2017 plan. Same with the red lines. The solid lines are existing to remain, and the dashed lines are new connections that are being proposed. The lightly colored, and I know it's hard to read at this scale, but the high comfort future concept routes, these were identified in the 2017 plan as kind of visionary, likely not to happen in the life cycle of this plan just due to the lack of development in those areas. You primarily find these out in the outskirts of town where development is likely not to happen in the next 5 or 6 years. So, notice the notes as well that will accompany the map, such as that the route alignments and the facility types are subject to change based on public works and Parks and Rec regarding trails, input and feasibility analysis. And again, just reiterating with that note number 2, that high comfort varies. It's not just protected bike lanes. It could mean a low speed, low volume, mixed traffic environment. So I realize that's a lot to kind of take in there, and I'll maybe continue forward and we can hold questions till the end. You guys tell me, I know this is more informal as a working session, but if there's any questions at this point, I guess I'll let you interrupt.
I don't see any. Why don't you go ahead and finish up, and then we'll give you questions.
Thanks. So just to recap why this approach, it gives Public Works more flexibility to assess each corridor on a case-by-case basis. It helps the city and county simplify and focus on the most important connections. A lot of these red lines will come up just kind of opportunistically with roadway preservation projects and CIP projects, but the black lines are really where the city and county can focus maybe grant applications or other funds. Next slide. So I'm going to go over just next steps. We're reaching out to the public for their input on this approach and the recommended project list. That's coming up at the end of this month, and it will go for about 4 weeks. We'll reach out in the same ways, using the same website with an online web map that people can put comments on. And as part of that, we're also conducting on July 10th a pop-up event where there will also be what we're calling a demonstration project. And this will be on Poly Drive near Rocky Mountain, where with Public Works cooperation and help, we are going to implement a temporary demonstration of what a protected bike lane could look like on Poly Drive by Rocky Mountain. And it uses temporary materials that can be taken down the very next day. And it's really just an opportunity to advertise the plan, catch people's attention, have something visual for them to look at and see and react to, and even try, while we present the plan to them with some tabling and posters and whatnot. Next slide. Big next step too, once we feel good with Public Works and everyone in the public about the recommended network, is how do we prioritize these projects? And this occurred in the last plan. We'll do it again with a little more refined approach. The approach we're taking to prioritize future investments is through two lenses. One is project benefit. This is answering the question, how well does it achieve the goals of the plan, regardless of feasibility? The second lens is project readiness or feasibility, recognizing that just because it achieves all the goals doesn't mean it's a high priority necessarily because of maybe some constraints. And so that is where we're getting Public Works input to be able to, if you go to the next slide, drop all of these projects into one of 4 buckets. And if you go to the next slide, that explains these 4 buckets for us. So at the end of the day, the prioritized projects will fall into one of these 4 buckets. The first one being short-term high priority. These are projects that they check a lot of the boxes in terms of the goals of the plan, and they seem like they're ready to implement soon. And so these are going to be first on the list. The next ones are long-term high priority projects, and this isn't necessarily next on the list, and this isn't necessarily a linear process because these projects don't get implemented in a linear process. But these ones are ones that they add a lot of benefit to the community in terms of reaching the goal, but there's some wrenches in the works there that have been thrown in terms of either engineering feasibility or funding. Maybe they're bigger ticket projects and they just need more study. Maybe they need external funding. The purple bucket, number 3, are opportunistic priorities. These are going to be the ones that a lot of the ones that have already been coming up through Public Works. They don't necessarily check all the boxes, but they might be easy to implement. So we're going to capture them when they come up. And then the low priority ones are projects that score lower on the project benefit and they're less feasible. So they're really going to, staff's attention isn't going to be focused on these as much in the next 5 to 6 years. Next slide. Lastly, this is my last slide. Sorry if this has gone long, but this is just the anticipated schedule and timeline moving forward for you all to be aware of. And we hope to be back presenting with you the draft plan in a few months.
Okay, thank you very much, Mac. Questions for Mac and or Elise, council members? Anybody? Councilmember Neese?
Thank you, Mayor. A couple of questions I had was on this plan, you're changing the names, I guess, from what the public is used to seeing about this, different pathways from a description of what it is to a type of lane. So one of my concerns is how do we know, and I've done this before, you're out skiing and you're on the blue run, the green easy run or something like that. Suddenly the only way to get down the mountain is a double black diamond. And how do you make sure that the people know when they get on one of these, easy routes that they don't end up on something like that? I mean, because it's one thing to say, yeah, this is the easy route, you get to the end, and now suddenly we did that once, and it was with our young kids, and it was not fun.
Oh, yeah. Sounds scary. Thank you, Councilmember East, for the question. I think what plays into that is we have a published bikeway and trail map, and we also have an app that we're going to be refreshing pretty soon. So I would encourage people who are using these facilities to check out those resources, and especially if they are kind of a more those interested but concerned group, kind of plan out out their route the first couple of times. Unfortunately, I would love to implement all of the high comfort facilities together and, just have it be ready and we could just go out there and use it. Unfortunately, that won't happen. So in the interim, we'll try to provide as much information as we can to the public so they're able to best plan out their routes.
Okay, so the classification may be high comfort, but only for that one segment. You may end up being into a difficult type of a road down the road. So it's kind of biker beware that you have to understand that. Okay, thank you. And the other question, I was actually out riding my bike this weekend and on Lake Hills, and I was wondering, why is the bike lane in the middle of the road? And so I'm wondering, when you talk about putting these different type of bike lanes, I've seen it where, and I think the downtown has this, maybe I'm wrong in the plan, but you have parking lanes and then you have the bike lane, separated that. But up in the Heights, at least this road, it's the bike lane and the parking. So is there a better way to do that? And is that going to change in this planning?
Yes, thanks, Councilmember Neese. So I guess we're not necessarily we might go into a little bit of kind of how these facilities are designed, but the general idea is that if you have the parking on you have basically the sidewalk and curb and everything, and then you've got a bike lane here and then parking, then those parked cars are protecting the people in the bike lane from the cars driving down the street. So it can be a pretty inexpensive way to implement some of these high comfort facilities. I'm not specifically familiar with the Lake Hills one, so I might call on Debbie since she's here. But that is kind of the idea going forward. And I believe that's the idea with the two-way restoration downtown. So
will that be part of this plan to change those ones that have the bike lane next to the traffic into, closer to the curb and move the parking out? Is that part of this plan?
So this is just suggesting general categories. So if we say we're suggesting a high comfort facility in this area, then Public Works would then take that and look at, okay, how can we make this high comfort? Is it flipping the parking in the bike lane? Is it adding a trail? Is it adding some other sort of protection? So that kind of gets determined at the design level.
Okay, so this map that we just saw doesn't really identify the areas in which we will know what will be high comfort or what will be changing or what we can have input into change.
So this does identify the areas that we're suggesting to be high comfort, but there's many ways to get to high comfort. So there's a variety of approaches that Public Works could take, and that was really, in talking with them, they wanted to have flexibility when they go out for design to say, okay, this is our end goal. We want everybody to feel comfortable riding on the street, whether it's somebody commuting to work, whether it's families with kids, whether it's seniors just kind of out on the weekend. But there's a number of ways, there's like a menu of options essentially that we could choose from to make that happen.
Thank you. I think that would be probably one of the least expensive ways. I don't know what it costs to stripe, but I think that'd be one of the least expensive ways to make an area a little bit more comfort by just changing the striping on the street.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Boyack, Councilmember Rufus.
So in the documentation here, it says 75 people attended the meeting in November. A survey had 201 responses. Mm-hmm. I mean, to me, that's very insignificant numbers out of 120,000 people. Mm-hmm. Are these just the same people all the time? Are you only catering to one group? How do you know what the general public wants if you don't get responses from them?
Sure. Yeah, well, like I said, we're trying new things all the time. I'm hoping with this with this pop-up event, it's going to be something very visual that I think will generate a lot of interest, and people will stop and be like, what is going on there? I want to stop and see what that is. It is guidance. We talk with stakeholders as well, different parts of the community. I think Mac pointed out a good point, which is that most of the people actually don't bike or walk for commuting. So there are people who did the survey who aren't necessarily biking or walking to get around town. So that was an interesting part of the survey.
Councilor Rupsis?
Thank you, Mayor. Elise, could we get a copy of this presentation?
Oh, yes, of course. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? I've got one. First, could you just confirm, I didn't see it on the map, or I wasn't looking at the time, but the connection from Zoo Drive to Riverfront Park, I'm assuming that's on there, and it'll be a high comfort desired route.
Yes. Do you want me to go back to that?
I'll take your word for
Yeah.
it. It's got to be on there, right?
Yeah, we do have the marathon loop included on there. Yes.
And then secondly, to what extent will our maps coordinate or not coordinate with Google Maps? It's absolutely critical on our bus routes, for example. It'll show you the route. Is Google Maps sophisticated, or is our input to Google Maps sophisticated enough to make recommended bike routes so that somebody can just follow Google Maps on the bike icon?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. So a number of years ago, when I was actually an AmeriCorps member, I actually would go and submit extra new bike routes that we had to Google Maps. I think they've changed their process since then, and I believe that our GIS department is maybe in touch with them. I can definitely follow up with GIS and see if that's something that they do. But yes, Google Maps is very good in terms of being able to plan out a bike route and just do it that way.
I would just recommend that you work with GIS
Yeah.
to make sure we understand systems, and because we want it to work as well as possible. And if there's any role for the public to be providing input, that we alert the public, and as part of this education process. I have no idea if that's relevant or not, but Councilmember Neese.
Thank you, Mayor. One other question on this plan is it addressing how some of these trails and off-street pathways, bikeways are to be maintained and or addressed regarding SEPTED rules? Because again, I went on a bike ride this last week with a bunch of kids up in the Dutcher Trail from Mary Street all the way down to the Metra. And that's a great trail. And when you're in a group, you're fine, but there's lots of overgrown trees and bushes, and there's fences down that no one can see anything that's going on in that trail. And so I'm wondering if this plan is going to address those type of safety concerns, and when you're building a trail like that, or when you're building subdivisions up against those type of trails, what type of recommendations should be followed?
Yes, thanks, Councilmember Neese. Yes, we were planning to include a discussion of SEPTED in there, so we can definitely have some of those recommendations from the National SEPTED organization of what would help make those safer. Obviously, the maintenance, of course, goes back to, funding, so that's not necessarily a silver bullet, but we can definitely include recommendations for the future. I know in our subdivision regulations, for instance, one of the suggestions for the updates was make the trail corridor wider. Sometimes now you have trail corridors in a subdivision that are fairly narrow, and so it's just kind of fences right up to it, and so there's not a lot of visibility. So that's kind of one example of something we've suggested in a subdivision regulation.
That is true. Again, bike riding through some of the new subdivisions up in the Heights, it's the same thing. They're having corridors from one block to the next block of just like a trail, and they're building, high fences, so it's just an unvisible, unsafe area.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's certainly a problem. We want to get away from those solid cedar or plastic fences, creating a tube. Councilmember Ripsis?
Thank you, Mayor. At least just actually one question. Yeah. As you're laying out these high comfort trails or pathways, I would assume something like, say, the Shiloh path would be a very high comfort until you get to intersections like King and Grand and things like that. How are we going to address things that seem to be very high comfort, but you have very high stress points along them? Are we going to also have a roadmap for specific improvements or ideas for how to improve roundabouts or dangerous intersections or other kind of pinpointed high stress areas?
Yeah, and Mac, maybe I'll let you take a first stab at that one. If you can still hear me.
Yeah, that's a really good point. There's guidance definitely in the industry about, not giving up at the intersection, how any any facility is only as safe and comfortable as its most dangerous and stressful location, right? And so we are scoped to provide some design guidance for crossing and what we call spot improvements, like crossing locations at uncontrolled locations and treatments for intersections. And so our hope is that Public Works, when they go to implement these projects, will lean on that guidance as well as guidance already produced by NACTO and FHWA on how to achieve high comfort through these high stress areas. But yeah, we're not necessarily designing any specific intersections or roundabouts or necessarily producing design standards for the city of Billings, but design guidance will be referenced for sure.
Okay, thank you very much. Councilor Bernice, and we'll call it good.
Yeah, Mayor, I just want to give a shout out to Public Works because we had some areas that you're talking about on the Dutch Trail where you cross Wicks and some of these really busy streets, and Public Works put up those flashing lights, and when you cross those streets, those flashing lights, those cars stop, and so it's been very, very much safer than it was before. So there's ways that I think we make these safer, but that's been a great improvement on that trail.
Great, very good. All right, Mac, thank you very much. Elise, very much. We'll ask if there's any public comment on this item. Is there any public comment on item 1?
Good evening, Mayor Cole and City Council. My name is Jack Genoway. I'm here representing the Billings Chamber of Commerce at 815 South 27th Street. I personally live at 1146 Princeton Avenue, and I actually am on the steering committee that's working on updating this master plan. And I believe that this is really taking a strong step in the right direction. The Billings Chamber of Commerce supports investment in a wide variety of viable transportation options that support walking, biking, and other transportation options in addition to driving. We sometimes call these transportation options transportation alternatives, using driving as the sort of default option for most people. And while that may be an accurate way to describe reality, I would argue very strongly that it is that way, not because it was handed down to us on stone tablets, but because that is the result of decisions that we have made in our infrastructure over the last 100 years or more. Henry Ford is once rumored to have said that if people had asked him if he had asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. When it comes to infrastructure, we have to think about the concept of induced demand, which a lot of you will be familiar with already. So people sometimes ask me why invest in bike infrastructure when so many people drive. But so many people drive because driving is the easiest option because of the way that we built our streets. So few people ride their bikes because many of them simply don't feel safe enough to try. I've been out on trail rides where I've met people who are much more experienced and much more competent cyclists than I am, who have told me that they will never ride on a city street because they simply do not feel comfortable with that exposure to cars. This approach really solves for that with the Spine network, and I believe that if it is built to these specifications, a lot more people are going to choose those transportation alternatives. Ultimately, having this plan in place is a responsible, long-term plan because it allows Public Works to take advantage of those opportunities to install some of this infrastructure as they're already out there working, which drastically reduces the cost of a significant chunk of this. It recognizes that bikes don't necessarily need to be everywhere. There are certain streets that are probably going to just be dedicated to cars. Not every single street in town needs to become a shared roadway. And ultimately, having quality bike infrastructure and walking infrastructure promotes a healthier population. It helps us attract the next generation of qualified workforce, and it allows the option for people to pursue high quality of life as they define it. For some people, high quality of life is a luxury sedan. For some people, high quality of life is an active commute. And we absolutely can and should do both. So this is a step in the right direction. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Any other public comment on item number 1? Any other comments on item number 1? No one's coming forward. We'll close the public comment period. And we'll move on to item number 2, unless there's anything else from council. Councilmember Ripsis?
If it's okay, I might just make one more comment, because Jack triggered a thought in my mind. It actually ties into what Roy was saying earlier. A lot of people will use alternative modes of transportation if they can accomplish something useful, right? So as we're designing this network, not only do we need high comfort corridors where people can cover a longer distance, but from that point, you've got to be able to get to something useful. So it's not enough just to have a high comfort corridor parallel to Grand, a quarter mile away, right? If you can't comfortably get from that corridor to Grand, where you might actually get to a grocery store or something like that. So let's make sure that as we're doing this, we're also thinking about, complete connections and not just, making nice pathways for people to go up and down the street.
Very good. Thank you. Good point. We'll move to item number 2, our street maintenance program funding. Debbie is going to be our presenter, I believe.
Good evening, Mayor and some of council. Okay, so my presentation morphed a little bit. The original idea for this discussion had to do with comments that were made during previous either SID or non-maintainable conversations. So comments about priorities that maybe we should have for this, the funding levels, whether it should be higher or lower. And so we thought we'd come and discuss that. And then after last week's budget discussion with the entitlement, we thought we'd kind of roll in a little bit of discussion about where this funding will affect, this discussion about funding for streets will affect the street maintenance funding, which is also affected by that entitlement. So I figured I'd just give a little recap of that, and then we'll have more conversation on that next week. So the city currently has 5 different ways that we maintain streets. We're going to talk about 2 of them tonight. The first 2, we improve non-maintainable roads. These are streets that have been paved before. They're not able to be maintained, so we have to be rebuilding them. The second is the gravel street program, where we have gravel streets that we're going in and paving those. Our paver program, which is the overlays, the chip seals, the slurry seals, all those things where we can maintain our streets. And then you've got our reconstruct. So like a Maloney Lane that happened this year. Maloney was existing. It was you knew the road before and after. So those larger scale arterial and collector projects. And then reactive. So we have an asphalt crew. We have pothole patching, but that's not really how we like to do things. We want to be more proactive than reactive. So I'm going to go through those first 2 programs. That's the I guess, main topics tonight. So the current non-maintainable program is one you've seen pretty much every year for the last 7 or 8 years. We've had this in place. So what happened years ago was we went through and we gave a number to every street in town that said it's a 60 or it's a 70, or we gave it a condition score. Anything that was below a standard that could be chip sealed or overlaid went into this non-maintainables. And it was supposed to be rebuilt, but there was never any funding and it was never rebuilt. So these roads that aren't being maintained have just gotten worse and worse and worse, to the point where they're just one big pothole at this point. So you can see on the map which ones we still have left. We've done quite a few of them with this project over the past several years. The way we've done that, and this is the basis of our conversation tonight, is talking about whether we should continue doing them like this. But we do, the city pays for anything that's existing. So if the asphalt's 20 feet wide, we pay for 20 feet of asphalt. And then the adjacent property owners pay to put in curb and gutter, or if they have a drive approach, any private improvement plus that curb and gutter. The biggest problem with asphalt is if you don't take care of that stormwater, it's going to be gone in just a few years. And we, of course, need our asphalt to last much, much longer than that. So that's how we fund it right now. We do not require sidewalks on these projects. We look at them as maintenance projects. And so the only time that we do add sidewalk into these projects is if they're on a safe routes to school street, or if there's some other requirement, maybe there's a park right next door where we've had requests. So normally these don't have a sidewalk component to them. We have 4.8 miles left. It doesn't look like that. When you look at the map, it looks like we just have a few little things, but that's 4.8 miles of roads left that are non-maintainable. It would take about $12 million to fix those, to rebuild those. If we continue funding them, like I said here, with us paying for what's existing and the adjacent property owners paying for the curb and gutter and basically what's new, the city would have $9 million of that, and the assessments would be around $3 million. So that's the current program. We address those right now by complaints, by high priority. There's some streets that are just so bad we get calls all the time, and so really high maintenance, high complaints. And then we also look at the cost of storm drainage. Some of these are really hard to address the storm drain. So if there's a storm drain project coming in a few years, it might go down on the priority list just so that we can get that storm drain in when we do the project. So we're not going to go over these. You got the presentation today. We can talk about these in detail if we want to do that later. But basically, we have these few roads left, and each one has some challenges, and they all have something beneficial about them. Obviously, if we don't do them, we're basically saying, okay, we're going to take this back to gravel, which is not the way we want to go on these streets. But some of these are pretty challenging roads. So as we start talking about this program, just keep in mind some of these specific roads. The next program that we talk about is the gravel street program, and this is, of course, gravel streets. A lot of these were constructed in the county, and then they were brought into the city, never built to a city standard. By and large, that's the way most of these were constructed. We have almost 11 miles left of gravel roads, so it's a significant piece. Collectors and local commercials, we've got about a mile, so that's good. This was a conversation we had earlier this year where we brought forward one project that was a cul-de-sac. It was pretty high city cost, and we did approve that. We are building that this year, but it really brought up the question of how should we be prioritizing these? Should we be funding them at this level? That sort of thing. So we have 10 miles of local residential left. So you're talking cul-de-sac street. A lot of these are cul-de-sac streets. A lot of them are, well, they're all local residential. So we're talking neighborhood streets. 3.7 miles of those have already been surveyed, and the people have said, no, we're not interested in paving our street, at least at the cost that we've talked about. 7.2 miles still need to be surveyed, so we haven't talked to them yet. And so we still need to get out and do that. If we were to hit those 7.2 miles, we'd be at $15 million. And that split is approximately 30% city and 70% assessment. So it's pretty much flipped from the non-maintainable cost. So our current approach to gravel streets is very much based on property owner requests. If you're on a street and you and your neighbors want to pave it, you come in, you request it, and we really, that's the biggest priority that we have. We also have complaints, high maintenance costs, and again, storm drainage pushes it down. There's a lot of areas we really are going to struggle to construct without storm drainage, so before that storm drain system gets into those areas, those will be tough ones. So that actually pushes the priority down a little bit. I'm not going to go into great detail on this, but I did want to talk about the way the assessments work right now. So if the property is physically addressed and it's a residential property, it pays for the improvements on the residentially addressed side. If it's commercial or industrial, it pays both sides. So that's where city, even though these SIDs come in and they've not been constructed and they're basically all assessed to adjacent property owners, those corner lots are where the city has that contribution. Right now, we charge basically a half street. So your half of the asphalt, your curb and gutter, and we do sidewalks on these. Primarily because we're looking at these as new projects versus maintenance projects. That was a decision made way at the beginning of this program. Certainly something that we should discuss to talk about whether the program's moving the way we want it to move. So this is the map showing the remaining gravel streets. They are scattered all over town, but you can see there's definitely a higher frequency of them occurring in the heights. That's also the area where the storm drainage is pretty tough. So those are challenging, but we've done it. I mean, there's a handful of them that have been done and they've turned out well. So I'm not saying it can't be done. So tonight, I think we need to discuss a few things. You'll see these again, but we need to talk about what our goals are for these projects. Do we want to get all our gravel streets done? Is that a goal still of the city council? It's been about 8 years since we've had that conversation. We've been working away at it. Maybe it's time to have that conversation again. What is our goal for paver? Do we want to meet those frequencies that we've talked about? Do we still want to be on the goals, the plan that we have for safe routes to school? Talk about the prioritization a little bit for all these projects. Do we say cul-de-sacs are last? Do we say commercial is always first? Like what do we want to do for our prioritization? And then the next thing is the assessment. Are we assessing the way we should be assessing? This is the part where it's going to impact funding. If we decide we want to up our city's contribution or reduce our city's contribution, those are going to affect where our funds are currently being used. And then sidewalk. Right now, like I said, non-maintainables, we do not require sidewalk unless it's safe routes to school or a park or something where we know people are using it. And then sidewalks we do require for SIDs, basically looking at them like new streets. So before we get into those questions, I did want to bring up the funding. Sometimes it's hard to make decisions if you don't have a good picture of what the funding looks like and where the funding currently is going. So all this table is to kind of show you where the current gas tax and SMD money goes. This is fiscal year 25, and this is where our funds go. So any change we make tonight, we kind of have to look at what shifts here. And then also, I don't want to lose that the entitlement portion of $400,000 obviously is going to come in here to make an effect or on that SMD that we talk about next week. So next Monday, the street maintenance district fees are coming back, so you'll see this again, but just good to have it in mind with the conversation we're having tonight. So as you can see, most of the funds for gas tax and SMD go to annual projects. Very few don't go to annual projects. So everything other than those bottom three are annual projects. And those are things like sidewalk, traffic calming, the travel corridor coordination. The intersection capacity is one intersection per year. This year it's a big one, a really big one. It's $1 million. Most years we can do about $500,000 to $600,000 for that. So that changes a little bit, but you're missing sidewalk is up there. Pedestrian crossings, Councilmember Nish, you talked about the one on, up in the Heights a little bit earlier. That's where that comes out of. So this is the list of funds and projects we have to think about as we talk about our assessments on the next slide again. So really that's my presentation. Now I thought we would just go through some of these, and I realize it's not a business meeting, so we won't have decisions made, but as we move through this, it'd be good to have a conversation so we know whether we should bring the program back at different funding levels or if everybody's kind of happy with where we are.
Thank you. So questions for Debbie. I'm just going to start off with one.
Okay.
Debbie asked us about prioritization. There's only so many dollars, of course, on and specific with gravel streets. If we just ignore gravel streets or ignore a cul-de-sac where there's limited through traffic or no through traffic, which makes sense. I mean, that's going to be low priority, obviously. What's the impact of on the system? Specifically, I've heard you say in the past that some of these streets, when they're not maintained, our maintenance costs go up, or contamination into the storm system and having to deal with sediment goes up. Is there any way objectively to sort of measure, regardless of traffic?
Yep.
That's an obvious one if it's a through street or safe routes to school, but are there other maintenance costs where it's not fair to other ratepayers to not put pressure on those residents to bring their street up to a more typical standard?
So to date, gravel streets have not been forced in. I mean, we have never in any case went out and said, you're causing a problem, you're high maintenance, you need to do this. Gravel streets have been 100% a neighborhood vote. So we've not done that. We absolutely have a way of tracking how much time we spend on different streets. Our non-maintainables, we spend a lot of time and money on those streets. And you can look at the map, looking at a couple of those, go drive them and get a sense of how much time it takes us just to keep that at all passable, some of those streets. So we can quantify those, and absolutely that is somewhere that we now look at prioritization. So if we have an area, street traffic will call us and say, we spend all our time on this street, it goes right to the top of our list. So it is part of the prioritization.
Okay, and that's important. Sorry, another hand, Councilmember Joy?
Thank you, Mayor and Council. Of course, I want to talk about non-maintainables because pictured all of those streets are in Ward 3. And as you know, we've talked about this for years, and trying to get the neighborhood to agree has been very difficult. Some of the properties are rentals, and there's absentee landowners who aren't going to ever agree to an assessment on their own property. So I wanted to ask, you have one of those goals, non-maintainables, get them done in 7 years. Is that an attainable goal?
So, yes, non-maintainables are not at the request or even the permission of property owners. Non-maintainables are 100% falls under the section of city code that allows you to force in those improvements. And so that's what we've been doing to date. And at the rate we have it funded and the amount we have left, we can get them done in 7 years.
And then a follow-up question about the non-maintainables. I believe it's a storm drainage split. I wanted to ask about that, assessment versus city funding. People over in that area in Ward 3, that the big storm that we had on Father's Day some years ago, that really impacted them because they do not have any stormwater drainage. So I wanted you to talk to that just a little bit. Thank you.
Okay. And I apologize, I actually should have went through this slide. It's not just a copy of the slide too before, it's actually what staff's recommendations are for these programs. But storm drainage is a little bit, I'm going to say subjective, but that's not really the word. I mean, we use the same policy every time, the same approach to it every time. If the street doesn't have storm drainage, that is typically the cost of the adjacent property owners because it's part of constructing that street. If it is part of a network, so we can drain maybe the corners, some of those areas you're talking about, if we can take some of the water off of Central and take it down those streets, we'll actually pay for a portion of that storm drainage out of city funds. So every project we look at with the same approach, but it turns out to be a little bit different every time. But storm drainage is looked at as part of that road. So we do always put storm drain improvements in. The question of how they're assessed changes a little bit project by project.
Thank you.
Councilor Renese?
Thank you, Mayor. Debbie, on your map, you had the only non-maintainable street in the Heights was it Glen Haven?
Here we go.
And so I just quite a coincidence. I happened to be riding my bike up there, so I didn't drive it, but I did notice it was just a standard road. I didn't notice a whole lot of damage to it. And so no curbs or gutters. And so are you saying that this street would, and this street would then have full curbs and gutters on this? Not sidewalks, but just curbs and gutters? Okay.
Right, so Glen Haven is low enough on its condition index that if we went over and just chip sealed it, it would fall apart. It doesn't have a good enough base, it doesn't have a good enough structure basically to hold up over time. So it needs to be reconstructed, and when it's done, it needs to be reconstructed with some kind of curbing, whether it be the flat type of curb, whether it be the full curb, but something that'll keep that asphalt for a long time.
Yeah, so, because that's what I noticed was, this is what my concern is every time we start putting in storm drainage with curbing and that, it was an uphill ride, so that means all of that water is going to be captured in regular standard curbs and run downhill, and then we're going to have to then treat it, or it's going to flood someone else, and we're going to have to capture it, and then it's going to increase the cost. And is it today, I don't know, are there problems with flooding today on this street with the way it's designed, where the water just runs off the road and runs into the neighbors' yards and things like that?
So I don't know if we get calls on storm drain today, but we design some like that. So if you look at some of the projects we've built, that's exactly what we do with the storm drainage. If there's no pipe anywhere near, or there's no outfall or any way of conveying that storm drainage, we'll actually just take it off the side of the road and put it in basically borrow pits, like kind of the old county standards you think about.
Or just into their neighbor's yard where
Yep.
it is going today. So if we were to do something like that, is that the kind of design? I mean, I'm okay with doing some of these things, but I don't like to capture more water to move it downhill to then have to have more expense to treat it. And so if we're doing something like that where you have just a concrete strip along to hold the asphalt in, that sounds reasonable, and then just kind of leave it the way it is. Not widen the street because, again, it's not a very, it goes to a dead-end street, a cul-de-sac anyway, so it's not highly traveled. Is that, when you look at doing these things, a street like that, you wouldn't necessarily widen or put in full length the curb, you just leave it, even though it may be a 40-foot or 60-foot right away, you're only going to leave it the standard what it is today, or are you going to expand it?
It depends. Everyone is different. So I can't really tell you off the top of my head what Glen Haven would look like. But every project we look at, you can go look at, and I can send you like the last 5 years that we've done. Every project looks a little bit different because they're all existing neighborhoods, they're all existing streets. And we try to make them fit where they are and work with what's there. So yeah, we do all kinds of things with the storm drainage, and we definitely do look at the use of the street. We've had a couple within the last year that we looked, no one ever parked on them, ever. They were, and we get there before people know there's a project coming, and we'll look at it over the course of several months. And if no one ever parks there, we don't build it with parking. We'll build it narrower. So, yeah, they're all different.
Okay. And then, Mayor, if you don't mind, a question about the gravel streets.
Sure.
Debbie, again, you mentioned, you're right, the Heights has a lot of gravel streets up there. I noticed a lot of these are marked not interested. I'm assuming you've then asked the residents, would you like to pave? Here's the cost. And they say, no, not interested, because they have to pay for the whole street.
Right.
Is that correct? So because the cost is higher to maintain those streets, are we allowed to have some type of SID maintenance for those gravel streets to compensate for the additional amount of work the city has to do to maintain their street because they chose not to have a paved street?
I'm assuming there is a way to do a maintenance district for gravel roads. That's a question I would have to look into.
Okay. I think if it's going to cost the city more to maintain those, maybe, especially if they opt out of the moving forward with that, then maybe that's the time we need to do something like that. But thank you.
On that one, then we'll come back, Councilmember Owen, though, on the creation of an SID on the process for gravel street sign, there's a bullet that says SID process need at least 50%. Correct me if I'm wrong, but at one point, my understanding was the city or the county with an RSID could just create the SID with 0%. We don't require any sort of petition. But they always have the right to protest and delay it by a year with 51%. So if we get an affirmative request by 51%, we can most likely rule out a successful petition. Is that correct? Because if it is, to Councilmember Bernice's point, we know that people are much more likely to take the path of less resistance. So if you're asked affirmatively, do you want something, they'll say no. But if we do something, they're much less likely to try to opt out. So is that the right process, that we could just initiate them, but they have the petition right?
So if a neighborhood wants to petition for a street, they can come in and do that. That's a little bit different than what we're talking about here. But yes, that's one way that we can get this started. The way we have done it is that we send out a poll, a survey, and most of you have gotten copies of those in your areas. And it says, are you interested? Are you at all interested? Here's what it might cost. This costs you nothing for us to proceed to the next step. If we don't get 75% at that point, we will never get 50% that votes for actual dollars. So unless we get good participation at that first part, we actually don't move along with this. When it gets to the second part, it's exactly what you're talking about. We're creating an SID where you have to get 51% protest to stop it. So it is on the kind of opposite side of approving it. It's the not protesting it that gets that passed.
Okay.
So we are talking about the same process there. For the intent of this, I just,
But
stated
the
at
quote
50.
vote is just advisory for our benefit, correct?
The first one.
Yeah, so, but we could just create the SID and see whether there's a successful protest, couldn't we?
Absolutely.
Okay, all right, thank you, Councilmember Rowan.
Thank you, Mayor. No surprise, you and I have talked about this quite a bit. I see it, I think, a little bit differently than my colleague does. I think for many of these neighborhoods in the Heights, and I'm talking here about the gravel program, these are older neighborhoods. They're often people who are original homeowners who've been there for decades, and they're the least able to pay for this significant burden. And I think they're also the most likely to feel that there's been some equity issues in where infrastructure dollars are invested in the city. So if I'm looking at the world from their perspective, if I have a choice between paying very high assessments or telling the city, no, thank you, I'm going to say no, thank you. But that doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. And it doesn't mean that at a different price point, they wouldn't make a different decision. And so I'm wondering if we're really balancing the equities in the current split that we have right now. And if there are some alternatives that might recognize that just because of where development has happened in the city, some of these older neighborhoods have been neglected. There has been more development on the west end, so we've invested in more capacity improvements on the west end. That's logical. But those Heights residents have paid those taxes as well, and now there's a need here. And so I'm wondering if you've thought about some alternatives and how we structure split funds, how we might approach this. Could we spread it over multiple neighborhoods to bring down the costs? I mean, what are the alternatives you've thought about?
So we do try to spread it over multiple neighborhoods. We had one just recently in the Heights, and we asked 4 different streets adjacent to each other, hoping to get the cost down. Do you want to do it? So,
but I think
that's
they
absolutely
consider
a way to
themselves
do that.
one neighborhood. I'm talking about like multiple neighborhoods.
Sure.
Yeah,
Yep.
sorry.
Absolutely. And anytime we can make a larger project, those costs go down. The price or the estimate that we send them at the very beginning is pretty broad. It's usually 15,000 to 25,000, or, just giving kind of a scale of where it could be. So we don't get into that level of detail when we ask for a survey. When we originally created this, and then again in 2023, last year, when we came back and talked about the SID policy, the thought behind that is that if you've never paid for your street to be paved, you need to pay it once. Whether you buy that house that the developer paved it, whether you do an SID, the idea has always been that the equity comes in that everybody creates the street in front of their home. So that's what this was, the 2004 one and the 23 one was predicated on, is basically that concept. I would say that we have done projects across the board, every zone, every ward, every zone. We did a project, one of the first ones we ever did was Clevenger on the south side. And everyone you talk to there is so happy that they did it. Their homes are worth more, they look great, they feel great.
Not to cut you off, but I was asking if you considered alternatives, not the justification of the current program.
Okay, well, alternatives, I guess, I don't see a funding alternative that's equitable to everyone else who's already paid for their street. We do try to do things like putting projects together to get those costs down. We try to do storm drain in a way that is cost effective. But no, we haven't looked at saying one group of people gets a break on this or another would.
Well, I'm not sure that they would see it as a break. I think there's some concerns that maybe tax dollars haven't been invested equitably, but let me set that aside for a second. I want to ask about the chart that is the SMD and gas tax funding chart.
Okay.
You've listed here what if I understand right, the FY25 allocations,
Yes.
right? But what we don't have here is additional revenue or additional sources of funds that could be allocated into these categories. So this is what is, but it doesn't give us information about what could be. Are there other sources that could be directed to any of these projects that aren't, sort of high demand elsewhere? Recognizing that every dollar is programmed intentionally.
Sure. So what I didn't put on here are those projects that use other funding. So urban funding, TA funding, grant funding, any of that is not on this. So this was simply what we have funded out of SMD and gas. So, there are, like I said, urban TA, those state funds that we get, the entitlement portion that we talked about previously. And that is pretty much the funding we have available for our projects.
Could you
and our
just
programs.
quickly give the eligibility for urban funds and TA dollars? What do those need to be spent on?
Sure. So urban funds are urban projects, and typically they do look at growth type projects. So in our case, we're looking at Grand Avenue because so much growth has happened around there. So anytime it's on an urban route as defined by our functional classification map, you can use urban funds on it. TA is transportation alternatives. So anytime it's something that will encourage or expand our transportation alternatives network, you can use TA funds on it.
So then, Mayor, the last question that I have is getting back to sort of costs and how we allocate funds. If what Councilmember Neese is saying is true, that the gravel roads cost a little bit more to maintain, does that higher maintenance cost advocate then for the city to take a higher burden because it would reduce ultimately the maintenance costs? Like, is there a tipping point at which we say, you know what, the 70-30 doesn't make sense. It would actually be better to be 45-55 or 60-40 because no one's going to accept it at 70-30. We see that. And so let's start tipping it in our favor of getting something more maintainable. Have we done that kind of analysis?
We have, so I have a couple slides here just in case you ask this question. So gravel streets really require grading 3 times a year, a little bit more frequently on some of them that are really kind of a mess. And snow plowing, if we plow residential, you have it. Our paved streets have actually a little bit more maintenance to them. So by turning gravel streets into asphalt, we're not necessarily reducing the maintenance on them. As you can see, there's quite a bit of maintenance just on a regular paved street as well. So different type of maintenance, but maintenance all the same.
Did you not say in your presentation that the maintenance costs are higher on gravel streets?
No, I said that we prioritize when there is one that has high maintenance cost.
Oh, I
Yep.
misunderstood. I see. Okay.
Yeah. And
thank
we
you.
do have some that we're out on all the time.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Councilor Ripsis?
Thank you, Mayor. So Debbie, I think we should be doing all the non-maintainables and gravel streets, right? The question to me isn't should we or shouldn't we, it's just how. And you indicated, I think, one source of discrepancy between the non-maintainables and the gravels. You said on the non-maintainables, we go out and every case is different. We may or may not put sidewalks in, we may or may not, widen the street. We take that one case at a time. But on the gravel streets, and especially in that initial letter that goes out, we say, you know what, we're going to build this out to a 34-foot wide standard street width, sidewalks and all that kind of stuff, which obviously has a large impact on the cost. A lot of those gravel streets, the big part of the cost, of course, is the sewer and that kind of stuff. But the other things, sidewalks and street width, definitely play into that. And especially out in Ward 5, and one of the sections there is 36th Street, which is people there are very rightly concerned that if we built that the same way we built the other sections of 36th Street, they would just get a drag strip right through their established neighborhood. But we're not presenting that kind of flexibility when we talk about the gravel streets. I think we should. Right? Those streets are local residential streets, as you said. They're not serving any broader transportation network purpose. But I think it's embarrassing that we have gravel streets in the city. We shouldn't, right? So we should fix them, but we should work with people to come up with a solution that fits the neighborhood and fits the cost. So I'd like to see us place more flexibility as we approach those gravel streets and come up with some different ideas of how we can design the street to maintain the existing neighborhood character, give them some breaks on the cost, say, maybe we don't need sidewalks for a street that, really serves no broader network purpose. The other thing is on the pricing side of things. I think we do have some options to look at helping property owners deal with the cost. That can be very significant. We could look at 30 years, because like you said, you should pay for it once when you build your house. Most of us who do that, you pay for it over 30 years. But we don't give people that option when we come through and do the safe routes to school, the sidewalks or the gravel streets or the non-maintainables. So we could be able to do that, right? We, city, might take more of the burden if we can only bond for 10 or 15 years or whatever. We could still assess the homeowners over 30 years. And, essentially be underwater for a little bit while that's happening. The benefit of doing that might outweigh the cost. The other thing we can do, and I think I might have sent a note to you and Chris about this, I forget where it was, it might have been Missoula. They're looking at deferring the cost of these improvements until somebody sells their home, right? That would be another way of saying, okay, it's bundled into the cost of your home. When you go to sell it, we're going to get that money back from the cost of the house. Again, we'd have some upfront cost because we'd have to do construction without, the revenues associated with it in the short term. But it might be worth the benefit of just getting those done, getting them off the books and moving on with our lives. So I don't know, that was a whole lot. Is there anything there you want to pick and choose and just kind of tear apart? Or, I just encourage us to be more flexible in how we're approaching these, because I think it's a big burden just to throw at people and say, hey, we hope you do this.
Right. So I would start with, that's exactly why we're here tonight. So we created this program and the way we wanted to approach this program years ago, and we've done it. And always with some of those things, you do it for a while and then you're like, yeah, you know what, this doesn't work, this does. I can certainly go through and talk about why we decided sidewalk was necessary on SID or on gravel versus not. And I can also go back and show you some projects where we were very different. We built them narrow, or we didn't put in a sidewalk on some of them for some reasons. But needless to say, let me talk about the funding pieces. So yes, we can be flexible on those. If we decide as a group that when you take a street from gravel to paved, we don't worry about the people walking, because I think most people drive slower on a gravel street than a paved street. That was what was behind it. But if we say, you know what, getting it paved is more important, let's do that first. Then let's figure out the walkability of it after. That's a conversation I think that we should be having. As far as the funding goes, I think those are all very reasonable ways to do it. It costs money. So that list that I gave you, something's got to give. So the SID, I believe, can only be 15 years because you can only bond as long as the improvements. And I think the street improvements are considered 15-year. I'll have to check with Jen, but I think that's why that 15 is there, because our bond council has told us that. I'm sure I have a text telling me the answer to that right now, but I think that's it. But like you said, can we fund that longer? We can, we just have to fund it. We have to find a funding source to be able to do those things. If we care enough about this, that it's our priority, then we should do that.
Debbie, here's an idea just to kick around, not necessarily advocating for it, but one of the problems with our current approach of dealing with projects on a street-by-street basis is we sacrifice economies of scale from just larger contracts. And you're good about trying to group them where you can. We just saw that in the tree streets, which is great. But you can't always do that. Theoretically, we could have some great savings if we did the whole city. All we're going to do, all the gravel streets over the next 1, 2, 3 years, whatever the time period was necessary. Cutting back from that, we're just going to do everything on the west end of town, or the center of town, or Heights. When neighborhoods choose not to participate, they sacrifice that economy of scale, both for themselves and for everybody else in the collective group. They also may trigger increased maintenance costs that we talked about that may be different from street to street. So here's the concept. What if we were to, for non-maintainable streets or gravel streets or both or some other grouping category, so we're gonna create 2 districts. One that's going to apply to the whole city or to a large portion of the city in order to capture those economies of scale. We're just going to go do all this through an SID. There may be petition rights, right? But you're going to have the option as a street not to participate. The catch is that you're going to pay either way. You're either going to pay and get your street paved, or you can opt out, but then you pay a much smaller portion, call it 20% or something like that, that is calculated to be the lost economies of scale for everybody, and the additional maintenance costs for your street that we'll continue to have to deal with because you opted out. So you pay either way. You probably get a better bang for the buck if you just had the street paved, but you don't have to. Just throw that out. You might want to think about that. Obviously, it could be complicated, but the concept is not particularly complicated. So there's one for you.
Okay. Yes.
And you're welcome to comment, but you don't have to. Councilmember Neese?
Thank you, Mayor. I agree with Councilmember Rupsis regarding the flexibility. So if I understand correctly, if you went on and sent a letter to a person on a gravel street, as the plan is today, you're telling them you're going to put in how wide a street, and curbs and gutters on both sides, and storm drains?
Yes.
And that's what the policy today requires you to do that.
Gravel streets?
On gravel streets.
Yes, and sidewalk.
And sidewalks, okay.
Yep.
Yeah, I think we do need to change that. I'm thinking of lots of different gravel streets that I've been on. These are small residentials. There's no reason why we need to put anything more than a little two-lane asphalt strip down with some nice concrete stripping, again, to prevent the asphalt from deteriorating and let the water run off into their front yard and water their grass. I think we do need to change that to, I think if we go back to some of these places that said no, and we say, hey, listen, we're just going to do your gravel street, and it's just going to be 2-lane, and I would imagine we would probably get more people participating. And I'm sorry, go ahead and you can address that.
Well, my comment would be, I think it's important that we have the flexibility to work with the neighbors. On a policy basis, whether we put in sidewalks or not, I think that's a great conversation. How we build the storm drain and how wide we build the streets should be something we work with the neighborhood. So we've went into some of these areas and everyone parks on street, everyone, and they want parking. And so we build parking. Some of them, they don't want parking and they don't park on street, so we don't build parking. So we need the flexibility to meet every neighborhood's needs. And so I don't want to make the policy so tight that there's no design anymore, there's no neighborhood. If you're asking for flexibility, that's absolutely something that we currently do, and we will continue and even try to expand on that. If we're saying we don't want to put sidewalks in whenever we do streets, just do them on safe routes to school, or just do them when they're near a park, or just do them when we see obvious need. That's certainly a change in where we are today.
Yeah, so let me clarify that, because you're right. I don't want it to be, that's the standard, that we only do a two-lane road. I would say that if you're going to do gravel streets, that would be like your minimum. Kind of replacing what you have there, but make it so you're not getting the gravel and the asphalt remains. And then if the residents want to go more from that and something that calls for that, then yes, I would think you need to have the flexibility to move up from there.
Yep.
But I think that if we start out with the fact that, hey, you're going to get the Taj Mahal and they don't even have the option to have just the pathway, then they're going to say no. And regarding, well, I'll come back to another issue.
Councilmember Joy?
Thank you, Mayor and Council. Could you put up the map of the gravel streets again? Because I'm thinking in Ward 3, there are a couple of them that down south of Old Laurel Road, you can see some red. Some of those, aren't they actually residential, not residential, but commercial? Two of the line, I think 2 or 3 of those, they're around Wonderland. Right off of there. I think those are actually a lot of commercial properties. Couldn't we as council just order them in?
So on gravel streets, you cannot order them in.
Okay, all right.
I don't believe the state law, and I'll have to check with Gina again, but our understanding is on SIDs for creating a street, it has to be an SID. For improving a street, like curb gutter, sidewalk, widening, that's you can force those in. I will verify for sure whether we can or not.
Thank you. Those are commercial properties, a lot of those. The other one that's a gravel road is actually a very kind of unfortunate, well, maybe fortunate, unfortunate, depends on if you live there or not. Between Randish car sales and the manufactured home, there's that unpaved street, gravel street, that goes back into that manufactured home park. And that's just to the benefit of one landowner if we never, ever pave it. But when people drive out, they pull onto Old Laurel Road, they can't get up very good speed, particularly in the winter. And it's very close to the intersection. I mean, since I guess it's not possible to just order it in, and there's only probably one owner, because it's just one trailer park. Sometimes we just run into unique situations in the city. I don't know what council thinks of that, but it would actually be very helpful if people could pull out of there without having to go off of a gravel road.
And I can look at that and see if it's actually public right-of-way, or if that's it might be a private access, and those are a little bit different. So I'll look at that one.
And Debbie, on the question of sidewalks on gravel streets, where I stand on that is we need to make a distinction between cul-de-sacs and through streets. Cul-de-sacs, I don't have any great problem necessarily with not providing a sidewalk. The traffic speeds are going to be much lower. You're really only impacting that neighborhood, assuming it's a relatively short cul-de-sac. You can walk in the street probably safely. But if it's through street, a chain is no stronger than its weakest link. And if you've got sidewalk on both sides of that missing link, you've impacted many, many blocks. If somebody can't make a continuous trip in their walker or on their wheelchair or on their bicycle. So it's a big distinction there in my mind.
So when we do SIDs, we bring them to you and we do talk about with the intent to create whether there'll be sidewalk or not. We've had a couple that we have not created with sidewalks because of a conversation we've had here. So we'll continue, maybe we'll approach those a little bit different, but continue to have that opportunity for discussion at a council level during the intent to create.
Okay, thank you, Councilmember Rivas.
Thank you, Mayor. I just kind of tack on to that, but a little different twist. Yes, if we have sidewalks on two ends, the through street might be seen as not consistent if it doesn't have sidewalks. However, there are designs for shared street spaces, right? And that's becoming very common. And maybe we should be looking into that, especially, I'm thinking about these ones here on the east-west streets on around 36 there in Mike and my words, right? They really only exist to serve those couple homes that are on there because they're going between 35th, which is the effective collector right now, and they just get out. It's not a safe route to school. If they were designed as a shared space street with the proper precautions in place that come with those things, it might be a relevant design for that type of neighborhood.
Okay, Council, are we ready to call it good on this, or at least open it up for public comment? Well, there's nobody left to comment.
Does Debbie have all her questions?
Yeah,
answers to her
Debbie,
questions?
so now everything is crystal clear to you, I'm assuming, right?
I'm going to leave you guys to answer it all when Jennifer comes for SMDs on Monday night. No, I do think, I don't know what the next step will be. This is my recommendation for a program. I think I've heard a couple of things tonight in regards to this. I can certainly change that, put it in a weekly, kind of what I heard. And the policy is it's more of an administrative approach. So I don't know that, the SID policy is what's in place and that you would have to change to do it this way. But when we actually approach a project, there's nothing that says it has to have sidewalk. It was a discussion and then an administrative thing. So I don't think I need anything further on that. I'll put what I've heard in the weekly, and then we can talk about whether I should come back to change any of the SID policy or something. If we're changing our assessments, we are going to have a policy change.
Okay.
So, Mayor and Council, what I heard, just sitting here listening, was that flexibility. Allowing staff some flexibility to work with the neighborhoods, and then cost of having options or different types of periods of time to repay. I'll look at methods like that. Those are the two main points that I picked up, if that summarizes what you've been talking about.
I think there's a high level of trust in your judgment on the details and the need to work with neighbors. It would be my assessment, but not always, I suppose. Right. It depends on what the facts are. Councilmember Owen?
I think I hate busy work. I really do. But I'm struggling to understand what different scenarios might look like financially on the gravel streets. So if we shifted the cost share, what would that look like? If we had more flexibility so that they didn't all have to be designed to a certain, what would that do to our cost estimates? What if we said, listen, you're in charge of the street, we're in charge of the sidewalk? I'm struggling to know what things are worth doing, other than just saying, please send out different letters to the neighbors, say that we're starting a design process and don't put cost estimates in it. I don't quite know how to move forward without some dollars around scenarios, but I don't want to send you off just to generate a bunch of scenarios for giggles.
So we have a lot of scenarios already. I actually have a slide with some of them. But not exactly formatted the way that you'd want to see it. But we do have some of those things that talk about different widths of street and the price per foot on a different type of street section. So I can certainly send that out. I think what I would recommend is that every time we start a project, we send you the letter. And we do that now. So you get the letter every time we start one of these projects. That's a great time to contact us and say, you know what, this street really looks like this to me, or this is what I've heard. Before we start the design, before we go too far, I think that's a great way for us to communicate on some of those. Everyone is so different that we could stand up here all night, and I'm willing, but we could stand here and we could go through 100 scenarios and we won't hit the one that we're going to hit next year. So I think that's a great time to talk.
Okay, Councilmember Neese?
Mayor, I think the other thing we want to make sure that that Debbie can be more flexible on what is that split. Instead of having a standard, I mean, if we find out the maintenance on that street is high maintenance, we should offer a higher share to the city. And so there should be some flexibility on, you know, as long as it comes back to say, well, this is the reason why we're going to have a higher cost share, then let us give a higher cost share to the city because we're going to save money in the long run. So I think there does need to be a lot more flexibility, as Kevin was saying, but not only in the type of design, but also the cost share.
Okay, Councilmember Ripsis?
I'd agree with that, but we don't want to set up a potential reason for people to delay doing it, right? In order to let it deteriorate and get to the point where we're going to take a higher cost share. I think maybe we need to say, hey, we want to have these done by X date. Right, and then kind of work to figure out, well, what's the plan, what is the design choices or financial mechanisms we need to be able to get there, and then start communicating with people like we are going to get these done, work with this early, or you know it might cost more later.
Yeah,
that's where
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, that is where this body needs to make those decisions. We have policies in place for the cost share. Those are approved by you, not changed by us. That is what it is. So if you want to revisit that cost share, that needs to be a council action that we do on a regular business night. And I need to understand, I guess, what to bring back. So if we separate those and we look at non-maintainables, right now we funded that for 7-year completion at the current split, which is about a 70-30 city adjacent property owner. So first I'd say, is that one you want us to bring back, or is it mostly the gravel one that we want to talk about? Non-maintainables are, the few remaining non-maintainables, you have a lot of them. Those are going to be tough.
Councilmember Joy, go ahead.
Thank you, Director Melling, for clarifying that. I think that we do not want to put in an incentive in any way for people to play this out any longer to get us to pay more of it. These same property owners have been asked over and over and over. And if they had done it 10 years ago, the cost, if we don't want to set something up where we're actually incentivizing delay, we don't want to set something up where we're incentivizing people to say no. And then, you know, now it's critical, we have to do it. And they're going to really grumble about the cost. But it's a kind of, it's a cognitive bias where we have short-term thinking. And if they had paved them in 2015, they'd be done and been much cheaper. So I don't think we want to incentivize people to delay it or to make it longer, and we don't want to incentivize them to just continue to say no to it. That to me doesn't make any sense. Thank you.
Debbie, the other thing I would comment is the value of seeing how we're doing, how the progress is. So you had some great slides in here that sort of identified some targets of 7 years. Those are relatively arbitrary, right? So, and I don't think we have to hold ourselves to that, but it's good to have a target, and it's good to see how we're doing toward that target to see whether we're ahead or behind schedule. So whatever that target is, having a chart each year says, hey, we knocked off our requisite 16%, or we're ahead or behind, I think is very helpful, and seeing it visually with some sort of a chart, all the better. And then related to that is what's the cost of delay? We talked a lot about increased maintenance costs, but what are those? What's the data? Why are we prioritizing this street versus that one? That helps us to judge the urgency. If it's not really costing us much to delay because the maintenance costs aren't that much greater, you know, the urgency goes away or becomes a lot less severe. So anyway, some visual way to track how we're doing and what's it costing by individual streets or increased maintenance costs or not costing, I think would be very helpful.
Okay.
Okay, Council, anything else that, Debbie, you want to raise for us specifically? I know
Well, I wanted to am I bringing something, a different policy back on the SIDs then? Is that what I'm hearing from this group, is that we want to revisit the SID policy that we approved in October?
What did you hear specifically that would be different
It's the assessment portion. So if we are not going to assess exactly per the SID policy, if we're going to take other things into account, that needs to go in that policy. It's a city council approved SID policy for how we're assessing.
How would the policy change, or what are the different things that would be taken into account? Because I'm not hearing a consensus on that issue.
No, that's,
So I
So-
would not say bring that back unless you want to give us certain alternatives more specific to way, and then we could say, yeah, it sounds good, but, because I'm confused about what specifically would change. Councilmember Neese?
Mayor, my thought was if we are having high-maintenance streets that the city's costing a lot to maintain, then because of the way the policy is written, the city and the landowners said, no, we don't want to have the improvement, as the city has to continue to bear that cost to maintain it. But if we can say we're going to share another 10 or 20% in that, because then we don't have to have any future maintenance, we have to give them the flexibility to do that. I'd like to see what the policy is so we can see if it can even be worked into that way where there's some offsetting options that we can do. I'm not so sure, if there's a recommendation you can make regarding offsetting some of that future maintenance costs on high maintenance, what would be considered high maintenance. And I don't know how many dollars we're talking about. Is it only, $100 a year because it's high maintenance, or is it, $100,000 a year that we're spending on some of these streets more?
So you're talking about providing a carrot in the assessment mechanism to prioritize those. I'm not opposed to that. It'd be nice if there was a little bit of a stick also where if they, as well, but Councilmember Owen?
Yeah, Mayor, I guess I would agree. I'd like to see a copy of the current policy. I was trying to Google it real quick, but I couldn't pull it up. But I also I need some time to think about the conversation before we move forward. Tom has raised some great ideas. I have some questions. I want to talk to constituents. I need to think this through. So I don't have a direction that I would recommend yet, but I also don't want to be done with this topic because I think it's a really important one. I agree. We shouldn't have unpaved roads in the city. But we need a little time to keep talking about this, I think, based on what I've heard tonight, much of which was new.
So I think we're kicking it back to you to come back to us with more specific details, alternatives, stuff like that. Councilmember Ripsis?
And I would just say, I forget who raised it, but the idea of, I'm sorry, I forget who raised it, but the idea of having, okay, this is your choice. We're going to do an SID to improve your street, or we're going to put an SMD on your neighborhood to maintain it at a gravel. Maybe that is the stick that said, okay, well, I can pay $250 a year to maintain this gravel street, or I can pay $500 a year and we'll have it paved and done and I won't have any more flooding in my yard.
Okay.
Councilmember Joy?
Thank you, Mayor and Council. I just want to make sure that it is a policy decision and not something that turns into someone coming into council and, just getting a better deal than somebody else. That is not fair. So just so that, because that's a previous experience, just so that it's in a policy and we can say, this is our policy. So, thank you.
Okay, very good. Anything else? I don't see anything. There's nobody to offer public comment, so we will conclude item number 2. Do we have any update you want to provide, Kevin, on upcoming meetings?
So the packet is out for the 24th, so just some highlights. The street maintenance district assessments will be coming to you along with the Public Works right-of-way fees, and also the City of Billings Planning Commission to comply with the Montana Land Use Planning Act. Those are probably 3 main things that are on there coming up on Monday.
Okay, thank you. Any questions for Kevin? Councilmember Boyette?
Speaking of planning, is there any update on Wyatt at all?
I have no update on Wyeth other than that I believe that they did get to move out of the hospital area and get out of that environment at least, but there's no further update on that.
Okay, thank you. So we'll close item number 3. Any public comment on non-agenda items? There's, again, no members of the public to offer comment. So with that, any items of council discussion? I skipped over that. Then we are adjourned. Thanks, everybody.